Chapter 4: The Drowned Village. The invitation came not as a knock or a summons, but as a thin envelope wedged under Ethan's door when he woke on the third morning in Blackhaven. He found it on the floor, its paper damp and smelling of river silt. No stamp, no name, only a single line written in jag-red ink: "The water remembers those who forget." Maya was already in the common room, sitting at the long oak table with a cup of black tea. She looked up when he entered, her tired eyes scanning his face. "You got one too." He held up the envelope. "Same handwriting?" "Identical." She slid a matching piece of paper across the table. Her words were more worn at the edges, but the ink was the same murky brown. "Silas told me the second trial comes fast. Usually within 72 hours of the first survival. It's meant to keep you off balance." Ethan sat down and placed his envelope beside hers. "He also told me to watch for mirrors and reflections. Said the prophecy pointed to still water." He paused, remembering the old man's cryptic warning. "But this feels different. The water remembers those who forget." That sounds like a rule, not a prophecy. Maybe both. Maya took a sip of tea. Trials have layers. The obvious rule keeps you alive. The hidden meaning keeps you sane. She set down the cup and fixed him with a steady gaze. "Whatever you do in there, don't trust the first thing you think is safe. That's how they catch you." The room fell silent. Outside, the perpetual twilight of Blackhaven pressed against the windows, grey and heavy. Ethan could hear the distant groan of the manor settling, the occasional whisper of something moving behind the walls. He had been inside for 3 days, and already the unnatural quiet felt normal. That, more than anything, unnerved him. Jack lumbered into the room, his broad shoulders brushing the doorframe. He was carrying a dented metal flask and looked like he hadn't slept. "You two got the invites, yeah? The wet ones?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I'm going too. Silas says it's a group trial. Means we stick together and don't get separated." Ethan glanced at Maya. She gave a slight shake of her head, a warning not to trust the young man's bravado. Jack had been in Blackhaven for only a week longer than Ethan, but he was loud and impulsive. People like that didn't last long. At noon, the 3 of them gathered in the entrance hall. The manor's great door stood ajar, spilling pale light across the stone floor. Silas waited beside it, his cane tapping a slow rhythm. "Your path is open," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "The gate will take you where you need to go. Remember what I told you, Ethan. Still water shows more than the surface." "You're not coming?" Jack asked, a note of panic in his voice. "I've already done my second trial," Silas replied. "The gate decides who enters each time. I would only be a liability now. Older survivors draw older pains." He gestured with his cane toward the door. "Go, before the threshold closes." Maya went first, her boots echoing on the stones. Jack followed, muttering under his breath. Ethan paused at the door and met Silas's eyes. The old man's gaze was unreadable, something flickering deep within them, pity, perhaps, or calculation. "The water remembers," Silas whispered. "But so do I. Be careful who you trust." Then Ethan stepped through. The world dissolved. The grey light of Blackhaven twisted into a spiral of muted colors: brown, green, a sickly yellow, and then reformed with a heavy splash. Ethan found himself standing knee-deep in murky water. The smell hit him first: rot, damp earth, old wood. He blinked, adjusting to the dimness. Overhead, a sky the color of bruised plums released a steady drizzle. The landscape was a ghost of a village: collapsed roofs, skeletal trees, stone walls draped in moss. Water covered everything, lapping against broken doorframes, filling the streets like a shallow lake. He turned. Maya stood a few paces away, already scanning the surroundings with a clinical calm. Jack was behind her, his hand resting on a rusted pipe he'd picked up from somewhere. 2 other figures materialized out of the mist: a wiry man with graying temples and a young woman with a sharp chin and darting eyes. Neither looked familiar. "New faces," Maya muttered. "They bring in fresh survivors for each trial. Some we'll see again. Others won't see anything." The wiry man introduced himself as Victor, a former security guard who'd been in Black Haven for 3 days. The woman, whose name was Lena but insisted on just call me Lee, had arrived the previous night. She spoke little, but her gaze stayed on the water. "The rule's clear enough," Jack said, his voice too loud for the oppressive silence. "Don't stare at the water. Easy. Keep your eyes up." "It's never that simple," Ethan replied. He looked around for any sign of a structure that might serve as a central hub. In the Shadow Theater, there had been a stage, a script, a clear locus. Here, the entire village felt abandoned, but something about it was too deliberate, the arrangement of debris, the way the water rippled in patterns that didn't match the rain. Victor pointed. "There's a church steeple over there. Might be high ground." The group started wading through the flooded street. The water was cold, seeping through Ethan's shoes and climbing his legs with every step. It moved sluggishly, as if thickened by silt, and occasionally brushed against submerged obstacles that might have been furniture or bones. Ethan kept his eyes on the rooftops, the trees, anything but the surface around him. But the longer he walked, the more he felt an urge to look down to see what waited beneath. He fought it. Lee stopped abruptly, her head tilted like a dog catching a scent. "There's something in the water to the left." They all froze. A few yards away, a patch of water was rippling in a tight circle, as though something had broken the surface and then submerged. But there was no wind, and the rain fell straight. "Maybe a fish," Jack said, his grip on the pipe tightening. "No fish in dead water," Maya replied. "Don't look at it directly. Keep moving." They made for the church. The building loomed out of the mist, its spire crooked, its wooden doors half submerged. A bell hung in the belfry, mossy and still. As they drew closer, Ethan noticed a pattern in the algae on the walls, long, sweeping curves like grasping hands. He filed it away. The church doors were wedged open. Inside, the floor was covered in a few inches of water, but it was higher than the street, offering a dry pew for them to climb onto. They gathered there, catching their breath. The interior was dark, lit only by the grey light filtering through broken stained glass. The altar was gone, replaced by a blackened hole in the floor. "This is a safe zone," Victor said, pointing at a placard nailed to the wall. It read, "You may rest here for 1 hour. No aberration will enter. But the water will come. Gives us time to think," Ethan said. He studied the placard. The words were carved in the same jagged ink as the invitation. "The water will come. That means we can't stay forever. We need to find the fragment before the water rises." "The fragment is usually tied to the Aberration story," Maya added. "We need to understand why this village flooded. Who drowned? And why the children are angry." "Children?" Lee's voice was sharp with alarm. "It's a guess," Ethan said. "The rule mentions those who forget. The pattern suggests vengeance for neglect. Something happened here that people tried to ignore. And the water remembers." Victor snorted. "This is too vague. We need solid rules." As if in answer, a sound drifted through the church, a faint, high-pitched laughter, like children playing in a distant yard. It came from outside, mingling with the rain. Ethan moved to the broken window and peered out. Nothing moved in the streets, but the water seemed to shimmer, rippling in concentric rings that converged on a point near the church. "Laughter," Jack said, his voice trembling. "That's not normal." "It's a memory," Ethan replied softly. "A remnant." He turned to the group. "We need to find the village records, or a school, or any place where children might have gathered. The fragment isn't random. It's where their story ended." Maya nodded. "The schoolhouse. Flooded villages always have a schoolhouse. It's a common focal point in trial law." Victor was skeptical. "And how do we find it without staring at the water to read the signs?" "We use reflections in glass," Ethan said. "Windows, broken bottles, anything that shows the sky instead of the water. We look up and interpret the warnings indirectly." It was a risk, but it was the only plan they had. The hour in the church passed quickly. Lee sat in silence, tracing patterns on the pew with her finger. Victor paced. Jack kept peering out the window, then pulling back as if afraid of what he might see. Ethan used the time to examine the church more closely. There was a guest book on a stand near the door, its pages waterlogged but partially legible. He carefully opened it. The last entry was dated 30 years ago, scrawled in a childish hand, * we played by the river. Mama said don't go. But we went. And the river came to us. * below it, in a different ink, someone had added, * they didn't look for us. They didn't care. *. A chill crept up his spine. This is their voice. The Aberrations. Maya leaned over his shoulder. It's a clue. They drowned, and no one searched. The hidden rule: the children attack those who refuse to acknowledge their suffering. Great, Jack said. So we just have to say we care, and they'll hand over the fragment. It's never that simple, Ethan echoed Maya's earlier words. There's always a price. We have to find where they're trapped and perform some acknowledgement, a burial, a memorial, something. The hour ended. Water began seeping through cracks in the church floor, rising faster than before. They had to move. They exited through a side door, wading into the flood. The water was now waist-deep in places, and the current had a malevolent pull. Ripples spread around their legs, sometimes forming shapes: a hand, a child's face, before dissolving. Ethan kept his eyes on the church spire, using it as a landmark. Victor spotted a collapsed building with a faded sign, * Riverstone Elementary. *. They headed for it. The school was a 2-story brick structure, half submerged. The ground floor was underwater, but the second story remained accessible via an exterior stairwell that clung to the wall like an afterthought. They climbed carefully, the metal groaning under their weight. The door to the second floor was swollen shut, but Jack put his shoulder into it and forced it open. Inside, the corridor was dry, lit by windows that looked out over the flooded village. Classrooms lined the hall, their doors hanging open. The walls were covered in children's drawings: sun, stick figures, houses, but at the edges of each drawing, the lines dissolved into jagged scribbles of black. Many of the drawings depicted a single figure floating in blue, with large empty eyes. Ethan moved from room to room, searching for anything personal: a teacher's log, a class photo, a name. In the third classroom, he found a desk with a carved name: Sophie, age 8. Inside the desk, a small diary, its cover peeling. He lifted it carefully and opened it. The ink had run, but some entries were still legible. April the 12th, the river is rising. Daddy says it's just spring rain, but I saw the water in my dream. It had faces. April the 14th, Mama says not to go near the riverbank. But I heard my friend Tommy calling from the water. He said there's a secret tunnel. I want to go. April the 18th, the water came into our yard today. I saw a hand reach through the window. It looked like Tommy's hand, but it was grey and thin. I screamed. Mama said it was my imagination. April the 22nd, I don't want to go outside anymore. The water whispers. It says we forgot them. It says now we have to join them. The last entry was a single sentence. The teacher said if we apologize, the water will go away. But we don't know their names. Ethan closed the diary. They drowned, and the villagers tried to forget them. The children became the aberration. But they're looking for acknowledgement, someone to remember their names, to say sorry. We have to find a list of names, Maya said. A register in the principal's office. The principal's office was at the end of the hall, locked. Jack kicked it open. Inside, a filing cabinet sat in a pool of dried rust. Ethan opened the top drawer, revealing folders labeled by year. He pulled the one for 29 years ago, the year of the flood. The folder contained attendance lists, parent permission slips, a class photo. The photo showed 23 children, ranging from 6 to 12, and 2 teachers. The teachers stood stiffly in the back, unsmiling. The children looked ordinary, but Ethan noticed that all of them wore blue ribbons in their hair or pinned to their collars. He turned the photo over. On the back, someone had written, *spring picnic, before the accident. There are 23 children, he said. But the class size in the register is 25. 2 are missing from the photo. Victor leaned in. Maybe those two died earlier? Or moved away? No, Lee said, her voice quiet. They were forgotten. The ones who died in the flood were erased from the memory of the survivors. That's why they're angry. Ethan nodded. We need to find their names. Maybe in a yearbook, or a newspaper clipping from the time. They searched the office. Maya found a stack of local newspapers in a crate. The front page of the issue from May 2nd, 29 years ago, read, *Flood claims 3 lives, local children missing after river overflow. Below the headline, a grainy photo showed the river, muddy and swollen, with a makeshift dam in the background. The text listed the names: Tommy Rains, age 7, Leah Whitaker, age 8, Samuel Grant, age 9. Only 3? Jack said. But there are so many voices. The newspaper undercounted, Ethan replied. Or the village only reported 3. The rest were children no one claimed. He felt a cold fury building. This was the heart of the trial, a community that had chosen to forget, to minimize, to move on without grieving. The water outside had risen, slapping against the school walls. The building groaned. The door to the stairwell creaked, and a thin stream of water began leaking under it. We need to perform a remembrance ritual, Maya said. We have to go to the place where they drowned, the riverbank, and recite their names. But we only have 3 names from the newspaper, Victor argued. We'll use the names from the class photo and the diary. Sophie, Tommy, Leah, Samuel, that's a start. The others will follow if we show we care. Lee stood at the window, staring down. The water is clearing. I can see something on the street below. Her voice was mesmerized. Don't look, Ethan shouted, but she was already tilting her head, her eyes locked on the surface. A moment later, she stiffened. A viscous ripple erupted around her reflection, and a hand of grey water shot up, grabbing her ankle. She screamed. The hand pulled, and she crashed through the window, plummeting into the water below. Lee. Victor rushed to the window, but Ethan grabbed his collar. Don't look down. Keep your eyes up. They heard a wet, choking cry, then silence. The water had swallowed her. A moment later, the ripples calmed, and the surface became glassy. Jack backed away from the window, his face pale. She's gone. Just like that. Ethan forced himself to breathe. She broke the rule. She stared at the water. We can't let that distract us. The only way to survive is to finish the trial. They now had only 4, Ethan, Maya, Jack, and Victor. The task pressed on them with greater weight. Ethan pulled out the diary and the newspaper clipping. We need to go to the riverbank. The entrance to the drowned village should be there. They left the school by the back stairwell, which descended into waist-deep water. The current was stronger now, pulling toward the edge of the village where a wide, dark river cut through the landscape. They waded slowly, keeping their gazes fixed on the sky, the trees, each other's faces. Every few steps, something brushed against their legs, cold, fleeting touches. The riverbank was lined with shattered trees and debris. A boat lay upside down, overgrown with moss. Here, the water was deep and still, like a black mirror. The rain had stopped, and the silence was absolute. Victor whispered, "Is this the place?" Ethan opened the diary to the final page. Sophie wrote that she heard Tommy calling from the water near the old bridge. There should be a bridge somewhere. They moved along the bank, and soon the silhouette of a wooden bridge emerged from the mist. Its central span collapsed into the river. The water beneath it churned gently, releasing bubbles that smelled of iron. This is it. Ethan knelt at the edge, careful not to look directly into the water. He kept his eyes on the far shore, but he could feel the presence beneath the surface. The water seemed to thicken, to breathe. Maya took out a piece of chalk she'd found in the classroom. We need to write their names on the bridge. It's an old ritual, carving names to be remembered. Victor climbed onto the remains of the bridge, balancing on a crossbeam. Jack handed him a stone, and Victor began carving the names. Ethan read aloud: Tommy Rains, Leah Whitaker, Samuel Grant, Sophie. He glanced at Ethan. Ethan opened the diary again. The name on the cover was worn. He'd assumed Sophie was the author, but there was no surname. He turned the diary over, and inside the back cover, in pencil, was a full name, Sophie Milner. He called it out. Victor carved it. The water began to still. The bubbles stopped. A low, mournful sound rose from the river like the crying of many children. It grew louder, then softened into a breath. Ethan felt the fragment take form. In his jacket pocket, something solid and warm appeared. He reached in and pulled out a small charm, a piece of blue glass, shaped like a teardrop, with a child's face smiling faintly inside. "It's done," he said. But the trial was not over. From the mist, a new sound emerged, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, deliberate and unmistakable. 4 figures materialized from the fog, all wearing identical gray coats. They moved with synchronized purpose, fanning out to block the bridge's exits. Victor froze. "Who are they?" One of the figures stepped forward, lowering her hood. She was a woman in her 40s, with pale skin and cold, reptilian eyes. She smiled without warmth. "The water trial's over. Your job is done. Hand over the fragment, and we'll let you finish your journey." Ethan's hand went to his pocket. "Gate of threads. Clever boy. Silas sends his regards." She drew a curved blade from her coat, the metal gleaming with unnatural light. "You can't win here. We've been inside this trial since the start, waiting for the moment you secured the prize. Now give it to me, and maybe I won't kill your friends." Maya stepped in front of Ethan. "You'll have to kill me first." "Gladly." The woman lunged. But Ethan had already been moving. His hand had found the faded script, the artifact from his first trial, and he was pressing it against the fragment. The script's pages began to glow, rewriting itself. It was a gamble, but he had learned in the asylum's memory that artifacts could combine in unexpected ways. The words on the page blazed, asterisk, and the water rose, and those who were forgotten remembered their vengeance, and the river claimed those who stole their peace. Asterisk. The ground trembled. The river exploded upward in a column of black water, and from its depths, dozens of childlike forms emerged, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They surged toward the Gate of Threads agents, not as attackers but as a flood, engulfing them in a vortex of cold and memory. "What is this?" Victor shouted. "The hidden rule," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "Only those who acknowledge them are spared." The agents never did. They ignored the children's pain. Now the children remember. The water swirled around the agents, dragging them under. The woman screamed, slashing at the air, but the water closed over her head. One by one, the grey coats disappeared. The vortex subsided, leaving only the rippling surface. Ethan collapsed to his knees. The fragment was cold against his palm, the light in the script fading. Jack stared at the river. "Did they die?" "They drowned," Maya said softly. "Just like the children." Victor touched the bridge. "The trial is stable. We need to go." They waded away from the river, leaving the bridge behind. The village began to dissolve into mist, the colors bleeding like wet ink. The transition was slower this time, as if the trial resisted their departure. As the world reformed into the familiar gray of Black Haven, Ethan felt the fragment pulsing in his pocket. He had won. But the victory tasted bitter. The Gate of Threads had found him. They had waited inside the trial, using it as a hunting ground. And Silas, who had given him advice, who had warned him about still water, was connected to them. The prophecy, the warning, was it a lure? A test? When they stepped through the manor's door, Silas was waiting. He stood in the hall, his cane still, his face unreadable. "You're back," he said. Ethan looked at him, the accusation building in his chest. But he held back. There was no proof. "Not yet. We didn't see you in there," he said flatly. "But I know who sent those agents." Silas's eyes flickered a micro-expression, quickly suppressed. "Agents? You encountered Gate of Threads inside the trial? That's unfortunate. They've been growing bolder. You warned me about the water. You also said be careful who you trust." "Indeed." Silas turned to walk away. "And I meant it. Trust is the first thing the gate exploits. Now rest. You have more trials ahead, And each one will teach you who your enemies are. He disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Maya took Ethan's arm. We need to talk. In private. He nodded, the weight of the fragment still cold against his chest. He had survived the drowned village. He had gained another piece of the puzzle. But the true trial, the war against the Gate of Threads, had only just begun. And somewhere, in the water of the next trial, there would be more forgotten children, more hidden rules, and more truths he wasn't sure he wanted to remember.